Hi. First, on behalf of all of us, I think thanks very much for being here and answering questions.
Thank you.
The main question that we have is the partnership with the Three Gorges company in China. Where do you see that going, and what's the nature of that relationship there?
So let me step back. Bit of history. There was a framework agreement signed between EDP and China Three Gorges. Okay? That was part of the last privatization phase of EDP back in the end of 2011. Through that framework agreement, public is, in one hand, China Three Gorges would be investing up to 2 billion in EDPR assets. Particularly in EDPR assets through minority stakes. And then, on the other hand, there would be potentially co-investment opportunities that should be pursued or could be pursued by the two companies. So I have to say that over the last 18 months, we have been focusing very much on the first part of the framework agreement. There is yet to be developed the second part of the framework agreement, which would be to have a co-development strategy in some specific markets.
Moving into a new market where there's no previous presence of wind energy, how do you convince the governments and the utility companies there to adopt wind energy versus other alternatives?
Okay. I'll give you one good example, South Africa. South Africa had no, actually they are building now the first wind farms. It's under construction. I believe that they set up this renewable program about 2 to 3 years ago. The assessment of South Africa is to understand, does wind make sense within the energy matrix? Is wind on a cost basis and looking to other strategic perspectives such as security of supply? Does it fit or not vis-a-vis the best alternative? And the best alternative is not what they have installed, but is what they will have to install as new capacity in order to fulfill the growth, the expected growth on the demand side. So any single country right now, and I think South Africa just did a good example, any single country is looking at, does wind make sense or not? I mean, apart from green attributes, does wind make sense or not from an energy matrix? And that means mostly from a cost perspective, but also does it, from a strategic perspective, either security of supply, access to natural resources, does it make sense? So it's not a question of convincing, it's a question of understanding what is the reality of that market, of the country.
Thank you for your presentation. So our question for you is, given wind is an uncontrollable energy source, how concerned are you with the reliability of electricity production?
Okay, there are, I would say, two different aspects to that. From a company perspective, the fact that we have a diversified portfolio worldwide is not something that we are concerned in terms of how we expect generation of cash flow going forward. Because, I mean, wind may blow in the US and may not blow in Europe, or vice versa. So from a company perspective, the fact that we have a diversified portfolio is a way to mitigate that, I would say, intermittency of wind. From a system perspective, so the country that has wind installations, that is primarily mitigate that risk, if you want, is mitigated through two different ways. One is through the grid. So the larger the grid interconnections, the better the country will have, the better will be the way to mitigate that intermittency, because imagine you may have wind blowing the north of Portugal, and if you have consumption in the south, in Lisbon, if you have a good grid connection, it will not matter, because you can actually, the energy will flow from north to south. If you don't have that grid connection, then you would have a problem because you will not have consumption for that load being generated in the north. And the second one is countries naturally tend to have some idle capacity, installed capacity, that can work as a backup. So in moments in time where it was foreseen to wind to blow and it doesn't blow because it's just a forecast, then that idle capacity comes into play and mitigates that lack of wind. So technically, you can also mitigate that from a country perspective or system perspective.
With the growing popularity in shale gas in the US, how do you see EP's growth in terms of the problems ahead?
Okay, again, the shale gas in the US is a reality. The question currently under debate in the US is to what extent US will open the shale gas market to exports. So there is, the US government has not authorized at this point, I think they have only authorized 2 export terminals. If they don't authorize more export terminals, it means that the US as a market will be an island. You will have a market splitting effect. You will have gas prices in Japan 3 times, 4 times higher than in the US. But the US cannot capture that value because you cannot export the gas. But as you see it right now, in some specific states in the US, typically the Central Corridor and towards the south, Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, with the existing wind speeds, and with the new technologies, we can actually be as competitive as a gas plant. So I would say that right now, shale gas in the US is a reality that we are living with, and we can cope with well. I think if anything, there could be potentially an upside if at some point in time you have these export terminals shipping gas to either Europe or Japan.
So you mentioned that you experimented a little bit with your solar energy in Romania. We were wondering if you considered that project a success, and if so, why or why not?
I mean, it was the first entry. I mean, it was the first step into solar PV. I have to say that the experience is, from an economic standpoint, from an execution standpoint, is very good. I mean, we know the regulatory framework in Romania, so we were comfortable with that. From an investment perspective, it did make sense. The question, and this is something that I think is a challenge, is that I would leave to the teams, is to what extent we can be or not differentiating entity or differentiating agent in the solar as we are in wind. But I would say that from a technology standpoint, it would make sense to have it in the portfolio. Again, the question is, if so, how much? But also whether we have or not really capabilities to differentiate ourselves.
Thank you. You talk about competitive advantage and the technology being connected with your core process. And our question is concerning trends and concerning the competitive advantage you talk about. What is your main source of innovation? Do you have a partnership with universities? Do you have your own research and development center, or you have a strong connection with technology startups?
Mm-hmm. But do you know what I think is the main source of innovation? We make mistakes. And we learn with those mistakes. As simple as that. We have been designing wind farms since 96, 97. The first wind farms were designed then. And we have been learning over time how to actually how to improve the estimates, the long-term estimates of the wind. We have a feedback loop then with the operating wind farms to make sure that if we got something wrong, we incorporate that into the models. We have developed our own in-house wind assessment team. So it's really having the experience, but being humble enough to understand what were the mistakes that we made, and instead of firing the people, actually making sure that they improve the model so that next time at least we don't make the same mistake.
How does you mentioned before that there's the PPAs and the government purchases of energy. Can you talk a little bit more about the difference in who's purchasing your energy, how that varies from country to country or from region to region?
Okay, so in broad terms, in the US, typically those would be utilities that have to meet either have to meet some green targets, or they look at it as a competitive source of energy vis-a-vis what they believe will be the long term of on the supply side in terms of their cost. That would be primarily in the US, so effectively you have a counterparty risk with a regulated entity. There will be some cases in the US and some countries in Europe, typically the Eastern European countries, where there will be trading companies that also want to have some, I would say, medium long-term exposure to these assets. So we are talking about 7 to 10 years hedges. And then mostly in Europe, you will have governments or state-owned utilities as the counterparty, and driven through those feed-in tariffs that effectively mean is the government that is the counterparty to the utility. And in some specific cases, which are also in US, and then Poland and Spain, and in Romania, you will have an exposure to a pool market. So it's just a merchant. You will have merchant exposure. It's a trading pool of energy based on marginal costs, and you will have exposure to those markets.
Talking about asset rotation program, do you consider any other types of asset rotation, such as leaseback agreements? And if, at which spreads is it possible for this company to get these leasebacks programs?
I believe that most of those leaseback structures are common in the US. They are not so common in Europe. So there are, it's something that I would not see perhaps too much feasible unless it's in the US. In what concerns spreads, I think it's hard to say what would be the spread for that. But again, the question is always the fundamental of the asset rotation. The fundamental of the asset rotation is, if I de-risk the asset, and if there is someone out there that has a long-term liability and therefore needs to have a long-term asset to match that liability and has a lower cost of capital than EDPR, then I would say it's the right target for our product. And I think that is the fundamental of the whole concept of the asset rotation. To what extent sale-leaseback would accommodate that, I'm not absolutely sure. Something that you can investigate.
How attractive do you see other sources of renewable energy, like for instance hydropower and solar power? Do you still believe you will be solely exposed to wind power in the future?
I will revert that question to you, and you will let me know on Friday if we should be also in other technologies or not. Let me just give a comment upon the hydro. Okay, hydro is a very specific type of assets, which is not likely the type of assets that EDPR would be the natural developer nor the natural owner. And the reason why, it's a type of asset that, well, first of all, you don't have many opportunities in Europe nor in the United States to further develop hydro capacity. It's pretty much already done. Secondly, the development, and if you want more, the engineering and construction is far different from what we do in wind, or even in solar, or even in offshore wind. So it's very, civil engineering focused type of engineering construction. But more importantly, the way you operate a hydro capacity, and particularly if you have hydro dams, is very similar to operating conventional type of technologies. What I mean by that is you can actually control the output of the plant. You can decide when to produce, which means that you need to have also a different skill, which is about trading. When and where you will decide to sell that output. So putting all that together, it's not the type of technology that EDPR will be looking, and actually within the EDP group, it's something that is not taken care by EDPR.